Every so often, something slips through the cracks. Something with rules that don't match ours. And someone knows what's happening, but they're not telling. You don't build fences in the middle of nowhere for no reason. You don't fly black helicopters over empty forests just because. Locals whisper about things with eyes that don't blink, tracks in the mud that don't make sense, things that travel in the dark that don't show up on thermal. Next up, we have 4 encounters the authorities don't want talked about. But yet, here we are, and you're about to hear them anyway. I wanted to pass along something I've been dealing with for the last few weeks while traveling through southern Oregon with my mobile beekeeping operation. You see, for the last 5 years or so, I've been bouncing around the region, mostly following the bloom cycles to keep my colonies healthy. I usually park my trailer and keep my hives near forest edges, where there's enough forage and ample water, and I work with local orchardists or small farms that need pollination. It's a way of life I really enjoy. Half local business, half exploring new corners of the state. This past May, I was set up near the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest, not too far from the tiny community of Agnes. It's a little out there, no real cell reception, and the winding gravel roads make it a bit of an adventure just getting in and out. I've been to this spot before, but only once. It's that stretch of forest where tall firs and cedars crowd the roadsides, and you occasionally see a bear or a cougar crossing. I never had any problems worth noting, save for the usual raccoons trying to get into gear, or the occasional skunk rummaging around trash bins. But this time was different. I got in on May 10th and spent the afternoon unloading my hives, about 8 of them. They were strong colonies, turned out well from the spring bloom near Bandon, so I was happy to see them foraging right away. Next day, while doing a quick inspection, I met a local fellow. He said he was a caretaker for a nearby summer cabin, and he mentioned black bears had been spotted a few miles up the road. I wasn't too worried. I keep electric fencing in my trailer specifically to ward off bears, so I set that up around the group of hives. It's not foolproof, but it normally does the trick. Flew under the radar for about a week, just checking on bees, collecting some honey, heading into Gold Beach for supplies when needed. May 19th is when things got weird. I'd finished up feeding around dusk, probably a little later than usual, and I heard a distant crashing in the brush, kind of a heavy snapping sound, like something big stomping around. I chalked it up to deer or elk. Early the next morning, I was up and out there at first light, bright and early. I could smell this pungent odor, almost like a wet dog smell but heavier, sour in a way, lingering in the air around the hives. Right away, I saw the carnage. 3 of the hives had been knocked over and ripped apart. Not just toppled, I mean ripped to bits. The frames, which are usually just wooden rectangles, were shredded in a way I've never seen. And I've seen what a bear can do. A bear usually goes for the brood frames and tears them out systematically. You'll see clean scratch marks, paw prints, that kind of thing. This looked like something with massive claws, or raw strength, had basically pulled the boxes apart from the top corners downward. The corners of the brood boxes were cracked and splintered in ways that didn't match usual bear damage. I noticed the electric fence wires had been yanked to the side, like something big had forced its way through, ignoring the shock. The unit I use is powerful enough to deter most animals, including a curious black bear. It was still running, blinking away in its normal pattern, so it hadn't gone dead. But something had brushed right through it or possibly stepped over it. I'm standing there, just in complete shock, piling the torn frames up off to the side. The bees were in a frenzy, obviously, and I had to suit up real quick before I could handle them. Honey was all over the ground, comb flattened into the mulchy forest floor. And then I saw these impressions, tracks I guess you could say, just inside the fenced area. Not shaped like a normal boot, obviously not a shoe, not a known animal track either, but big, wide, maybe 14 or 15 inches long, pressed deep into the soil. The best I can describe is that it reminded me of a broad, almost human foot with a wide toe splay. The ground there stays damp because of the shade from the tall conifers, so it preserved the impression pretty well. At first, I thought maybe someone had come through messing around, but you'd expect footprints of a smaller size, or maybe multiple prints from standard boots. Also, who does that and literally rips beehives apart with their bare hands, or with tools, in the middle of nowhere? I ended up going on a tangent mentally, trying to figure out if I'd somehow upset a local who didn't want me around, but that made no sense. Folks in that area either appreciate the pollination or don't care one way or the other. Plus, these tracks were way bigger than any average person's. I decided to gather my nerve and move the surviving hives back into the trailer for the time being. I spent that entire day reassembling what I could, trying to salvage brood frames, saving the bees that were left. I use a propane smoker to calm them during such times, but they were extremely agitated. One thing that kept nagging me was that odor. I'd get a whiff of it whenever I moved around near the tree line, like something moist and animalic. It's hard to describe because it's unlike anything I've smelled dealing with bears or elk, or even cougars. Around midday, a forest ranger's truck came down the road, some older fellow just patrolling, and I flagged him for a quick chat. He didn't seem too interested, told me raiding hives was typical black bear behavior this time of year, especially if they were just coming out of a rough spring. I tried to show him the footprints. He just said tracks can look funny in soft ground. Then I mentioned the fence was still operating. He shrugged and said, might have shorted if vegetation touched it, or something along those lines. I got the feeling he either didn't believe me or simply didn't want to get into it. He left pretty quickly anyway, had somewhere else to be. I tried to patch things together for a couple more days, but I kept hearing weird noises in the woods at night, like heavy cracking of branches. Sometimes a weird vocalization that wasn't quite a whoop and not quite a howl. I'd keep my lights off and peek out of the trailer windows, but I never laid eyes on anything. I'll admit I was spooked. I started thinking about all those rumors you hear around southwestern Oregon about big hairy beings in the woods. Sasquatch legends that local loggers, fishermen, mushroom pickers, and old-timers talk about in hushed tones. I always took it as local folklore, but it sat differently with me, given what I'd just seen. I started second-guessing the bear explanation. By May 23rd, I'd had enough. I lost too many bees, and the area felt off. Usually, I'm comfortable in rural places. Been doing this a while and grew up around farm country in the Willamette Valley. But this felt different, like I was trespassing on something else's territory and wasn't welcome. Packing up took me the better part of a day, and the entire time I felt watched. I know that sounds paranoid, but it was the strong sense that there were eyes in the tree line. Whenever I looked over, I'd catch movement in the corner of my eye, but it could have just been the breeze moving branches or a trick of the light. Before I left, I took a closer look at the ground around the fence line. The footprints, if that's what they were, seemed even more pronounced in the sunlight. There were bits of hair stuck to the wire fence, short and coarse, not the black fur you'd typically expect from a bear, more like a dark brown or maybe even dark auburn color, but it's hard to say. And it wasn't big clumps, just a few strands that got snagged. I bagged them in a little plastic container I had for my queen supplies, but I'm not even sure what to do with them. I half expected them to blow away in the wind or something. Since leaving that spot, I've been stewing over it for days. There's that part of my brain telling me it had to be a bear, right? But the rational side of me that's seen plenty of bear damage can't square up what happened to those hives, the huge footprints, that overpowering musty aroma, and the way the fence was broken. I ended up hearing from another beekeeper acquaintance near Brookings, who said something similar happened to him last year, though not as severe and with fewer signs of footprints. I haven't told him all the details yet. He'd probably think I'm nuts if I mention anything beyond bear trouble. I know you run a channel where folks share their personal encounters, so maybe you've come across stories like this. It's the kind of event I can't quite shake, and I've seen plenty of wildlife damage. But this was a whole other level. I keep replaying the scene in my head. Those twisted hive boxes, the frenzied bees, and those strange tracks. It's going to stick with me for a long time, and I don't mind saying I've been reluctant to venture too far off grid since. Whenever I recount the details, I get this unsettled feeling in my stomach, like I shouldn't be talking about it, or maybe I'm not supposed to have seen it. I'm sending this because I've been turning it over in my head since it happened, and I still can't shake it. I'm a traveling nurse and have been rotating through a few regional clinics and small hospitals across the Upper Peninsula. The shift that stands out took place a few weeks ago, right at the tail end of that nasty winter storm that buried Iron Mountain and Marquette under several feet of snow. Actually, I was originally assigned to a clinic near Houghton, but they reassigned me at the last minute to a home visit in the outskirts of Baraga County, almost on the edge of the Huron Mountains, near this really rural stretch of road that doesn't even have a name on some maps. It's just State Forest Road 16, or something along those lines. Driving out there at night was eerie enough. No streetlights, no other cars, and the wind had blown up these huge drifts of snow so that certain parts of the road felt like a narrow tunnel, which was a real treat at 2:30 in the morning after a 14-hour shift, let me tell you. I remember hearing the sides of my SUV scrape against some branches or low-hanging tree limbs. I had the defrost blasting full force because the windows kept fogging up. My fuel gauge was inching dangerously low, thanks to a last-minute rush over from Houghton without topping off. Every once in a while, there'd be a clearing where the moonlight broke through, lighting up the tree line. Then just endless dark again, swallowing me up. I was about halfway to my destination when something caught my eye along the side of the road. Movement, but not like a deer or a fox, or any of the usual suspects that dart across the highway. It was small, maybe 3 feet tall at most, and at first I thought it was just an owl or some large bird perched oddly on a branch. I slowed down more out of exhaustion than curiosity, but as I did, the thing seemed to unfurl these wings. They weren't huge, more the size you might see on a hawk, but the shape of the body, it was shaped like a tiny person except for the strange reflective eyes. If you've ever seen an animal's eyes reflect in the headlights, it was like that but more intense. It was perched in such a way that reminded me of a gargoyle on those old cathedrals, kind of hunched, with knees bent, and these folded wings behind it. I swear, it looked right at me. I didn't want to stop. I was bone tired and just wanted to finish my shift. But it's not like you can unsee something like that. This is where it gets weird. For a few seconds, it flew alongside me, or at least that's what I think it did. My windows were up, so I couldn't hear anything. But in that strobing effect of passing under the moonlight patches, I'd see it briefly in my peripheral vision, almost gliding next to the passenger side. Then it seemed to vanish into the trees. I was shaken, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some weird large owl missing feathers or a big hawk. But the shape was all wrong, and I'm no bird expert. But I know enough to recognize that birds don't have something akin to arms and legs, the way this thing appeared to have. It was like a scaled-down version of the sketches I've seen of the Mothman, though those sketches usually show a much bigger creature. By the time I arrived at the patient's home, I was honestly rattled. The place was an old log cabin that had been converted into a year-round little house, and it was nestled between clusters of cedar and pine. The woman I was checking on had severe rheumatoid arthritis, and it was my job to do a follow-up wound check. I spent longer than I probably should have inside, because I just didn't feel like going back out. I kept thinking I'd see that thing perched on the roof when I came out, or maybe waiting by the SUV. It was a restless feeling, like I was on edge for no clear reason. The patient asked if I was okay, and I just mentioned I was fatigued from the drive. But I couldn't shake this nagging feeling that something was still out there. After I finished up, I left around 3:45 a.m. or so. The snow had picked up again, which made the drive back even more treacherous. I crawled along at 20 miles per hour, expecting a deer or coyote or something else to pop out of the trees at any second. I was scanning the roadside, feeling my heart hammer. The road was basically deserted. No plows, no other cars, and not even a hint of civilization. At one point, I swear I saw a dark shape land on top of a snowbank further ahead, but the wind was whipping up so much snow, it could have just been a swirling eddy or my eyes playing tricks. Eventually, I made it back to a more populated highway near Lance, where there were at least a couple of gas stations and some lights. Pulled over for coffee and to top off the tank. The clerk was a young guy, Probably a college student from Northern Michigan University or something, working the overnight shift. He must have thought I looked frazzled because he asked if I was all right. I told him I was tired and saw something weird out in the woods. He chuckled, said folks around here have plenty of Bigfoot stories, or they talk about weird flying creatures down near Point Bay. But the way he said it, like it was no big deal. Maybe he was used to hearing travelers spin yarns. I didn't press him for details. Sometimes people clam up when you press these topics. Or maybe I just wasn't ready to hear more. The next day, I got to talking with a coworker who's from the UP originally, and she's big into local legends, especially around the Keweenaw. She asked me if I'd heard of odd sightings near old mine shafts or around the edges of Lake Superior, where the cliffs drop off. She mentioned rumors of some bird-like humanoids that occasionally freak people out in the deep woods. She didn't call it Mothman, but her description lined up a bit with what I'd seen. I was half tempted to drive around with her to see if we could spot it again, but part of me never wants to be that creeped out on the road again. I leave the area in a couple of weeks anyway, so maybe I'll just let it go and not stir anything else up. That said, I'm still hesitant every time I pass that tree line on subsequent assignments. It's not the easiest route to avoid, given where I have to go for these home visits, especially after the storms knocked out a lot of the alternate roads. There's this unsettled feeling in my gut whenever I drive after dark now. Even in open daylight, I'll catch myself scanning the skyline or checking the branches, looking for any sign of those wings. The memory of it has really stuck with me in a way I can't fully explain. Maybe I'm just tired. Maybe the long hours and the winter nights in these lonely, foreboding areas are getting to me. Still, part of me can't shake the notion that I crossed paths with something a bit beyond normal wildlife. I've been on the road for the better part of 3 months now, moving between small-town congregations across Montana. I've never been drawn to any one location for overly long. My ministry feels more effective on the move, going where folks need me. So late last week, I ended up out near Glendale, which used to be a bustling town back in the silver boom, but is pretty quiet nowadays. There's a small chapel near the old cemetery on the outskirts, not much more than a clapboard building leaning a bit too far to the north. I had a notion to stop there for a night service, or at least to see if the caretaker would let me stay in one of the side rooms. It must have been just after sundown when I finally made my way up the gravel road that leads to this chapel. The caretaker, whose name I jotted in my notes somewhere, he's an older fellow, bald on top, but wore a battered old baseball cap that read Dillon, Montana Rodeo, 94 if I recall correctly. He'd warned me that the property can feel downright lonely after dark, and that I might want to keep the doors locked. I remember half joking, if a man of the cloth doesn't feel safe here, that's quite a testament. He didn't say a word back, just shrugged in this uneasy manner. It unsettled me more than I care to admit. Anyway, after I brought my modest possessions into what passes for the chapel's back room, I started hearing this howling. It didn't sound at all like your average coyote or wolf. I've heard my fair share of both, especially in the more remote parts of the state during my travels. This was deeper, with a kind of throaty resonance that made the vibration carry through the wooden walls of the chapel. I actually paused the prayer I was mumbling, because I couldn't concentrate. Like something was telling me, you might want to pay attention to that. I stepped outside, and at first the only thing I could see was the silhouette of a few gravestones. That old cemetery's actually grown pretty wild with weeds and uneven ground. A little moonlight aired out across the field, but not enough to make anything truly visible. Then, as I'm standing there, I get another jolt of that howling. Closer than before, definitely. About that time, I realized my heart was pounding like a hammer inside my chest. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was just spooking myself. The caretaker had left for the evening, figuring I'd lock up on my own after any nighttime prayers. So I was alone, and it was quiet, except for those occasional gusts of wind that make the pine branches scratch at each other. The next time that howling came, I thought it was behind me, near a patch of old gravestones that were partially fenced off. The fence was more symbolic than anything, just a few rusted rods and some bent wire. I debated shining my small flashlight out there, But something in my gut told me that might not be the best idea. Yet you know that feeling when curiosity outweighs your better sense. I clicked on that flashlight anyway. First thing I saw was this shape, hunched, maybe halfway behind one of those worn-down headstones, but it was easily the size of a man. I thought it could be a big dog or wolf just standing on its hind legs or perched on a low rise. But then I realized it was too upright, like it had shoulders. Shoulders on a canine. That instantly felt wrong. And as I started to edge the flashlight a bit more, the shape turned toward me, and I caught a glimpse of a snout. The eyes picked up the beam with a weird color, maybe a yellowish reflection, but it's hard to describe. It was unbelievably tall, or at least it gave the impression of something with both power and unnatural posture. The entire time, my brain was telling me this is impossible. It's just not something you see, let alone in the back of an old Montana chapel at, what was it, maybe 9:30 or 10 at night. My mind was racing, and it did something I still replay over and over. It looked like it was sniffing the air. I couldn't hear that specifically, but I got that sense from the movement of its head, the way it angled upward, like it was testing whatever breeze was rolling past. It was only a few seconds, but they felt like forever. I'm going to get off track for a second. Back at the caretaker's shack earlier, I noticed they had a seasonal calendar pinned on the wall from some local feed store, and the caretaker mentioned offhand that coyote sightings had been up that year, scaring local ranchers' cattle. But I've never seen or heard of anything that can stand upright and still look comfortably balanced like that. And the face was so distinctly elongated, more like a German shepherd or a wolf, but absolutely bigger, with what I'd call an unnatural intelligence behind those eyes. That's what got me more than anything else. That sense that something was looking back and sizing me up. There was no barking or growling, just that single, low, almost hoarse howl from before, which I could still feel in my chest. I tried to keep my composure, but my hands started trembling enough that I had to grip the flashlight with both hands. I slowly backed away, deciding that if it was going to come at me, I'd at least try to do something, but I wasn't sure what. Before I got inside, I dared another quick look to see if maybe it had moved off. But no, it was still there. It tilted its head sideways in a weirdly curious manner. That's the last glimpse I had before I basically stumbled back inside, locked the door, and slid a chair in front of it. Funny how a wooden chair feels like such a flimsy defense when you're dealing with something you can't even begin to understand. I spent the next hour or so in prayer, but my mind was only half there. I kept listening for that scraping or howling that might signal it was at the door. But weirdly, after that last sight, the howling ceased altogether. The night settled into silence, and I eventually managed to doze off, but it was restless. In the morning, the caretaker came by to see if I wanted coffee. I didn't say much, just told him I heard a strange coyote, and he gave me this look. It wasn't disbelief so much as wariness, like he'd heard similar descriptions, but didn't want to put anything into words. I drove out of there as soon as I could. The caretaker thanked me for stopping by, told me I was welcome any time, but I have a suspicion he was relieved to see me go, perhaps because he didn't want to have to explain anything more. Throughout my drive to Butte, every time I drifted into thought about that thing, I'd yank myself back to focusing on the road, like my subconscious was trying to shield me from lingering on details that are too terrifying to revisit. Anyway, I nearly stopped myself from emailing you because I'm still rattled by it, and I don't want to scare anybody unnecessarily. But I can't shake the feeling that I needed to share this with someone who documents these experiences for a wider audience, especially on your YouTube channel. I've already decided I won't be traveling through that spot at night again, even though I'm sure there are faithful folks who'd welcome the ministry. I just can't in good conscience risk stumbling on, or disturbing, whatever that was. I wanted to get this down before memory starts playing tricks on me. I've been a traveling truck mechanic for something like 15 years now, mostly bouncing around west and central Texas, because there's always freight hauling going on, and trucks that need fixing. Not a big talker when it comes to the unexplained, but I've seen some strange things in the skies, especially around these wind farms. Just nothing like what I caught sight of a few weeks ago outside the town of Roscoe. I was on a late-night job near the Roscoe Wind Farm, which is along Interstate 20, not too far from Sweetwater. It was probably close to midnight when I pulled off the road to check on a rig that had a coolant leak. The driver called my dispatcher because his temperature gauge was spiking to the red. So I get there, pop the hood, and realize the coolant line's got a small crack. Not the easiest fix on the side of the highway, but I carry plenty of replacement parts if it's relatively minor. The wind was blowing pretty steady that night, and those turbines, they're huge up close, almost hypnotic the way they'd spin in the dark. I've always been kind of fascinated with them, though I'm used to seeing them by now. I started working while the driver waited in his cab with all his lights off. I don't know if it was the wind turbines moving that caught my eye, or just one of those weird instincts you get sometimes in the dead of night. But I looked up at the sky and saw this ring of lights. Not super bright at first. I almost dismissed it as a reflection off my own rig, or maybe a plane. If you spend enough time out on the highways, especially at night, you're going to see your fair share of illusions. But these lights moved in a pattern that didn't match any airplane or balloon or even drone formation. They seemed to be spinning in a circle, maybe half a mile off from where I stood, hovering right above the far side of the wind farm. I heard no sound aside from the usual breeze and the hum of the turbines. It was like my ears were playing tricks. I expected some kind of noise, but I could only hear that low mechanical whir in the distance. Anyway, I tried to get a better look, but it was tough to spot from my angle because the turbines themselves were huge. I'm talking about the kind of windmills that tower 20+ feet, with those long blades. The lights were just above them, so I had to crane my neck back. The weird part was how they kept that perfect circular arrangement while rotating. Sometimes you'd see one dip a bit, or the ring might shift a few degrees, but it kept real steady overall. I remember thinking maybe it was some test from Dyess Air Force Base over in Abilene. Folks around here see a lot of aircraft doing practice runs at night, but nothing I've ever observed or fixed, since I've done some side work on ground support equipment for local bases, though it's usually hush-hush, moves so smoothly and well-formed, especially in total silence. It must have lasted a good minute or two, though it felt longer because my brain was going a mile a minute. I forgot all about the coolant clamp I was holding, and just stared. At one point, the driver stuck his head out the window and asked if everything was okay, because he noticed I wasn't tinkering under the hood anymore. I just waved, not wanting to spook him. He couldn't see what I was looking at due to his angle. I did a slow walk a few steps away from the truck, trying to get a clear vantage. The lights were still there, but then they seemed to merge, like each individual light started pulling in toward a single point, almost like they collapsed into each other. I didn't see them fly off like a shooting star or anything. It's like they all turned into one bright dot and blinked out. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a chill. I finished up the truck job in record time after that, gave the driver a heads up that I'd be on my way, and got back into my service vehicle. I sat for a second scanning the sky, half expecting those lights to pop back up. They never did. Drove back towards Sweetwater to find a diner or gas station open for some coffee. But at that hour, you're usually out of luck. Eventually ended up at a 24-hour Love's travel stop, just east of Sweetwater, trying to wrap my head around what I'd just witnessed. I've always been skeptical of UFO stories. My dad was a big UFO buff, always watching old VHS tapes about sightings in the 80s and 90s, showing me newspaper clippings from around Stephenville when there were rumored sightings there back in 2008. I mostly shrugged it off, but now I'm not so quick to dismiss. The shape, the silence, the weird flickering circles. It was nothing like I've ever encountered before in all my time on these roads. I know plenty of planes and helicopters come out of Dyess for training, but that silent rotating ring was something else. I don't know what exactly was happening above those turbines. It makes me wonder if anyone else was repairs at the wind farm that night, or if any other drivers on I-20 saw the same swirling lights. The only reason I'm telling you is because you might find it interesting for your YouTube channel. Maybe someone else captured something similar on camera, though I'm kicking myself for not even trying to grab my phone. It just didn't cross my mind until after it was gone.